Let's get to our lesson tonight. This is 2 Samuel chapter 19. And David returns to Jerusalem. Now, there are 6 things that happen here as David comes back. And let me kind of present the general picture that will sort of tie these 6 things together as to why they might be mentioned the way they are. You see, Absalom had won the hearts of the children of Israel to himself, and they had abandoned David. It wasn't just the 10 tribes. He had won the hearts of David's own people, the men of Judah, to him. And David escaped Jerusalem with just the little armies and bands he had around Jerusalem. He was greatly outnumbered when he went to Mahanaim. And Absalom had gathered the troops all the way from Dan to Beersheba to fall on him like the dew upon the ground. And they probably had everything figured out, but Joab, I tell you, Joab, you read about him, and sometimes he just makes you cringe. But you can't deny that Joab was good at being the captain of the host. He knew how to make an army fight, and he knew his strategy. And he took David's outnumbered forces into the woods of Ephraim, and Absalom comes on with Amasa as his captain. Amasa doesn't know what he's doing. They get out there, and listen, they slew 20,000 men. And that outnumbered army defeated the greater numbers because they were just better soldiers. They were better fighters. And David recovers his kingdom. But he's at Mahanaim. But you remember when the messengers came to David, David's question was, is the young man Absalom safe? And of course he wasn't. And we close that last chapter. And even though David has won this great victory, he is grieving over his son Absalom. Enter Joab. You know, Joab's the one that had killed Absalom. After David said, be gentle with the young man. And Joab, he's hanging in the tree, and Joab took 3 darts, threw them into his heart, and then had his 10 men around him and said, go ahead and finish him off, and they killed him. It was a very cruel death. But that's Joab. I mean, But Joab is good at what he does. You're going to find that out in the next chapter too. That Joab knows what he's doing when he's fighting. But David is going to be the one that is going to know how to pull his kingdom back together. So you got 2 very different personalities here. But it starts off, well, we got a memory verse. That's where we got to start. These are kind of picked at random. And like Lily Ann said, it's short. Okay, so here's the memory verse. And the king said unto Barzillai, 2 Samuel 19:33, come thou over with me, and I will feed thee with me in Jerusalem. You almost make that rhyme. I will feed thee with me in Jerusalem. So maybe that little rhyme there going through there will help you remember those words. Now, David's at Mahanaim. I'll try to get a map to show you what's going on. We got a lot to cover in this chapter, so I'm going to try to keep moving. David is at Mahanaim. There's the forest of Ephraim where the victory was won, and David is at Mahanaim, and he is in grief. And so Joab is going to come scold David. I tell you, Joab, he's so brash. Yet he's good at what he does, but he does it in a way that just almost make you cringe. Now here we go. 2 Samuel 19, 1 through 8, where Joab scolds David. You'd think it'd be the other way around. David would have scolded Joab for killing Absalom. But instead, Joab goes in and scolds David for grieving over his son. Here's how it happens. And it was told Joab, behold, the king weepeth and mourneth for Absalom. And the victory that day was turned into mourning unto all the people. For the people heard say that day how the king was grieved for his son, and the people got them by stealth that day into the city, as people being ashamed to steal away when they flee in battle. They had come back, the victors. They're kind of quietly going into Mahanaim, just almost like they're the ones that ran away from the battle. David's grief had had a depressing effect upon his supporters. So the king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, "Oh, my son, Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" And Joab came into the house of the king and said, "Thou hast shamed this day the faces of all thy servants, which this day have saved thy life, and the lives of thy sons and thy daughters, and the lives of thy wives, and the lives of thy concubines." And notice this, "in that thou lovest thine enemies and hatest thy friends." Joab, he just could not relate to this. If someone's against you, you kill them. That's Joab. This is very simple. This is how you live. If you got an enemy, you kill him. But David was not that way, and this was his own son. And Joab was very frustrated at King David now. "So, thou hast declared this day that thou regardest neither princes nor servants, for this day I perceive that as Absalom had lived, and all we had died this day, then it had pleased thee well." Well, you can tell Joab's really giving it to David. And then he says this, and Joab's telling him right, because David, even though there's no doubt he has this deep personal loss and grief, he's still the king, and he's got to take care of his kingdom. You would think Joab could have told him a nicer way, but that just wasn't Joab's way. He's very direct into it, and Joab was right about this, not in the way he told David, but in bringing David up to the fact that, David, you're the king, you need to start acting like a king. "Now therefore arise, go forth, and speak comfortably to thy servants, for I swear by the Lord, if thou do not go forth, there will not tarry one with thee this night, and that it will be worse unto thee than all the evil that befell thee from thy youth until now." And Joab was probably right about this. The whole kingdom is in conflict and turmoil. And now David, the one they ousted, he's going to come back as king. And it's a very politically precarious situation. And Joab knew this just isn't going to work, David. If you just sit back here in Mahanaim grieving, you've got to get out there and be our king. And David rallies himself, and he becomes a great king in this chapter. It says, "Then the king arose and sat in the gate, and they told unto all the people, saying, Behold, the king doth sit in the gate. And the people came before the king, for Israel had fled every man to his tent." Now, next part. Judah is appeased with what David's going to do with Amasa. You remember Amasa? When Absalom became king, he put Amasa as the captain of the host instead of Joab. Amasa was the one that had led the armies of Israel against David, and the ones that Joab had defeated in battle. But Judah, David's own people, had their hearts turned away from David. And David's going to try to win their hearts back, and he's going to do something that is very politically astute. And what this symbolizes here is how David is going to look after his people. So here's what happens. All the people were at strife throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "The king saved us out of the hand of our enemies, and he delivered us out of the hand of the Philistines. And now he's fled out of the land for Absalom. And Absalom, who we anointed over us, is dead in battle. Now therefore, why speak ye not a word of bringing the king back? They're talking to Judah. Hey, this is David's of Judah. This is the tribe of Judah. Why aren't you bringing the king back? Well, David sent Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, saying, speak to the elders of Judah, saying, why are ye the last to bring the king back to his house? Saying, the speech of all Israel is come to the king, even to his house. Ye are my brethren. Ye are my bones and my flesh. Wherefore then are ye last to bring back the king? It's like Judah, they weren't welcoming David back to Jerusalem at all. They were kind of standing off here. And say ye to Amasa, here's what David's going to do. I'll win the hearts of Judah back. I'll let them know I got no ill will against you for what you've done here. We'll show them with what I do with Amasa. Say unto Amasa, thou art not of my bone and of my flesh. God do so to me and more also, if thou be not captain of the host before me continually in the room of Joab. And he bowed the heart of all the men of Judah, even as the heart of one man, so that they sent this word to the king, return thou and all thy servants. Now, can you imagine that? He fires Joab and hires the man that had led the army against him, so you be the captain of my host. Now, you know Joab, if I was Amasa, I'd been worried about that. And we're going to find out in the next chapter he should have been worried about that. But let's go on with this chapter now. Next, Shimei. You remember Shimei? When David was fleeing Jerusalem, Shimei ran along the top of the hills cursing David and throwing rocks and stones down at David and throwing dust in the air. And Abishai, he said, let me go up there and take off his head. David said, no, David's depressed. Let him curse. If all I know, the Lord's caused him coming up there and curse me. Just let him do it. Well, now Shimei is going to come back and he's sorry for what he did. Shimei is going to be pardoned. David makes his way down to the Jordan River and he's preparing to cross. Shimei comes down to the Jordan River to see David. 2 Samuel 19, 15 through 23. So the king returned and came to Jordan. And Judah came to Gilgal. Now that's right across the Jordan River from where David is going to cross. So David's come down to the river. Judah's come down to Gilgal. That's near unto Jerusalem. And they came down to meet the king and conduct the king over Jordan. And Shimei, the son of Gera, a Benjamite, which was of Bahurim, hastened and came down with the men of Judah to meet King David. And there were 1,000 men of Benjamin with him. And Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, and his 15 sons and his 20 servants with him. And they went over Jordan before the king, and there went over a ferry boat to carry over the king's household and to do what he thought good. And Shimei, the son of Gera, fell down before the king as he was come over Jordan, and said unto the king, let not my Lord impute iniquity unto me. Neither do thou remember that which thy servant did perversely in the day that my lord the king went out of Jerusalem, that the king should take it to heart. He said, I hope you didn't take me serious here when I was running across the hilltops cursing you and throwing stones. I really didn't mean it personal. Don't take it to heart. So Shimei is very humbled here. For thy servant doth know, and here he does, look what he says, I have sinned. Therefore, behold, I am come the first this day of all the house of Joseph to go down to meet my lord the king. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, answered and said, shall not Shimei be put to death for this, because he cursed the Lord's anointed? Abishai still, he just wanted to take off his head. That's Joab's brother, Said, well, let's just put him to death. Well, David does this. David said, what have I to do with you, ye sons of Zeruiah, that ye should this day be adversaries unto me? Shall there any man be put to death this day in Israel? For do Not I know that I am this day king over Israel. Therefore the king said to Shimei, Thou shalt not die. And the king sware unto him. David didn't want to come back to Jerusalem putting people to death. He's wanting to come back to Jerusalem and be their king. He wants to win their hearts back to him. So he just pardons Shimei. You're not going to die. Next, Mephibosheth comes to see David. Remember the story? Mephibosheth, lame in his feet, the son of Jonathan, the grandson of Saul, whom David rescued and said, You'll eat at my table. And Ziba and his sons and his servants will farm your land and give you the produce, and you can just stay right here in Jerusalem with me at my table. And he befriended Mephibosheth. But when David left, Shimei shows up and said, Mephibosheth thinks he might get the kingdom back. Now Mephibosheth shows up. Mephibosheth comes down from Jerusalem to meet David. And Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. And he had neither dressed his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he came again in peace. He came down, he was a mess. And he looked like a mess. And that gave evidence that Mephibosheth had been mourning that David was gone from Jerusalem instead of rejoicing. And it came to pass, when he was come to Jerusalem to meet the king, that the king said unto him, Wherefore wentest thou not with me, Mephibosheth? And he answered, My lord, O king, my servant deceived me. For thy servant said, I'll saddle me an ass, that I may ride thereon and go to the king, because thy servant is lame. And he hath slandered thy servant unto my lord the king. But my lord the king is as an angel of God. Do therefore what is good in thine eyes. He said, Ziba, that servant, he deceived me and he slandered me. But you're the king. You know what to do. You just do what you think's right. What's good in your eyes. For all my father's house were but dead men before my lord the king. See, when David became king, if he'd done like all the other kings did in that time, he just put all those other folks to death. But David didn't do that. He said, Yet thou didst set thy servant among them that did eat at thine own table. What right therefore have I yet to cry any more unto the king? And the king said unto him, Why speakest thou any more of thy matters? I have said, Thou and Ziba divide the land. And Mephibosheth said to the king, Yea, let him take all. For as much as my lord the king is come again in peace unto his own house. Mephibosheth had no ambition for himself in this. And you think, why didn't he just give it all back to Mephibosheth? Why didn't he divide it? Why did he divide it with Ziba? Well, Ziba had been a good aid to David during this time. And remember now, David's trying to pull things together. He's trying to keep conflict suppressed. And that may explain David's actions here. All right, Barzillai. He's got to be one of my favorite characters in the Bible. Old Barzillai. He's 80 years old. That rich old man had come to David's aid. And so David wants to repay Barzillai. And here's how this story goes. That's where that star, it may have been further north than that, but as best I could determine, that's where Barzillai's home was. And so it was right in the path on the way David to Mahanaim. Barzillai was in a good position to help David. And now Barzillai shows up. Barzillai the Gileadite came down from Rogelim and went over Jordan with the king to conduct him over Jordan. Now Barzillai was a very aged man, even 80 years old. Now, back in David's day, if you're 80 years old, you're an old man, okay? So here's old Barzillai. He had provided the king of substance while he lay at Mahanaim, for he was a very great man. And the king said to Barzillai, Come thou over with me, and I'll feed thee with me in Jerusalem. Barzillai said to the king, how long have I to live, that I should go up with the king into Jerusalem? I'm this day 80 years old. Can I discern between good and evil? Can thy servant taste what I eat or what I drink? Can I hear more the voice of the singing of men and singing women? Wherefore then should thy servant be yet a burden to my lord the king? He said, I don't even know what's good for me anymore. I can't tell what's good or evil. I can't taste anything I eat. You feed me all this nice food, I won't be able to tell it. I want to know it's so good. I can't hear. I can't tell if it's men or women singing. I can't even tell they're singing. Now, why do I want to go to Jerusalem and be a burden to you? Thy servant will go a little way over Jordan with the king. And why should the king recompense it with me with such a reward? Let thy servant, I pray thee, turn back again, that I may die in my own city, and be buried by the grave of my father and of my mother. But behold, thy servant, Chimham, let him go over with my lord the king, and do to him what seemeth good unto thee. Don't do that. If you want to reward somebody, just let me go home and be buried by mother and dad, back in the old family cemetery, back home. That's what I want to do. But now I've got a young servant here, so just show that goodness to him. He's been a good servant, and he'll be a good servant to you. Take him, show that kindness to him. So the king answered, Chimham shall go over with me, and I will do to him that which shall seem good unto thee. And whatsoever thou shalt require of me, that will I do for thee. And all the people went over Jordan. And when the king was come over, he kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and he returned to his own place. How do you not love an old man like Barzillai? Now, one more. The king went on to Gilgal, and Chimham went on with him, and all the people of Judah conduct the king, and also half the people of Israel. Now, there's going to be strife between Judah and Israel. And this really sets us up for what's going to occur in the next chapter. And you'll see that next week. But this shows how precarious the political situation was, and how important it was for David to try to garner his support and pull the kingdom and the nation back together. Here's the strife. It sounds almost petty here, but it just shows. Sometimes when people are upset, it doesn't take much to set them off, does it? And so here we have it. And behold, all the men of Israel came to the king and said to the king, Why have our brethren, the men of Judah, stolen thee away, and have brought the king and his household and all David's men with him over Jordan? Well, they were the ones that had been fussing about Judah doing this, and now when Judah did it, says, why is Judah getting all the attention here and getting first place here? And so all the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, because the king's near kin to us. Wherefore then be ye angry for this matter? Have we eaten at all at the king's coast? Or has he given us any gift? So the men of Israel and the men of Judah are disputing now over who should bring David back to Jerusalem. And the men of Israel answered the men of Judah and said, We have 10 parts in the king, and we also have more right than David than ye. Why then did ye despise us, that our advice should not be first had in bringing back our king? But it says, the words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel. Well, that's where the chapter ends. That sets us up. Things are not well. The state of the union is not good, okay? And we're going to see how this dispute, how there's a man that's going to try to take advantage of this turmoil, and he's going to get himself in a lot of trouble. And that's in the next chapter, because you can guess it, Joab's going to come back in the picture. And he's going to fix things for David again. And we'll see how that happens then in the next chapter. Well, to me it's fascinating. It shows David, you look at all the turmoil David went in, and a lot he brought on himself. But look at David's wisdom in being king, trying to be forgiving of his enemies, and not trying to just set himself and make things justify everything for himself. He's looking at the bigger picture. I got to be a king over a kingdom. I want to bring the kingdom together. And so in a very unselfish way, David is trying to rule as king. After David is dead and buried, the kings follow in David's wake, the children of Israel and of Judah are going to look back. I wish they had David back. They'll remember the good he did as a king. All the way into the New Testament, they're looking for a David to come back. And they're looking for the Messiah to be king in the room of David. And it kind of helps explain here the attitude that the Jews had toward who they thought the king ought to be when the king returns. And it's not going to be like the Christ, who is looking more at a spiritual kingdom than an earthly kingdom. And this kind of helps explain down the line how those attitudes will have formed. We don't have an earthly kingdom now. Well, we do. We're in one, but that's not what we're after. The kingdom of God is a spiritual kingdom, and we can be as His kingdom. And we need to have a bond of peace among ourselves. And we do it by gentleness and forbearance and long-suffering and forgiveness and love with one another. And the very reason we're admonished to do that in Ephesians chapter 4 is because we need that. Everyone in this kingdom that we're in is not always going to behave just like they should, and neither are we. And so we need that long-suffering. And we need to give that long-suffering to one another and have that bond of peace. That's what Paul talks about when he says to endeavor to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The unity of the Spirit's a doctrinal unity. But that bond of peace has to do with how we treat one another. And so we need to treat each other well in this kingdom. You want to be part of this kingdom? The greatest kingdom that's ever been established. And you were born a citizen of the United States. You're born again to enter into the kingdom of heaven. So if you want to be baptized, come into that kingdom. You can do it while we sing the invitation song.